Excessive force, a growing threat. The use of excessive force by administrative law enforcement is a pressing issue in America. We see it in our headlines and in our communities. This isn't just about isolated incidents, it's about a systemic problem. One factor contributing to this crisis is the militarization of administrative law enforcement. When we equip officers like soldiers and train them for war, it changes how they view the public. They are supposed to protect and serve. But the increasing use of military gear and tactics creates a dangerous US versus them mentality. This has eroded trust between administrative law enforcement and the communities they swear to protect. It has also led to a rise in civilian casualties. The consequences are devastating. Families are torn apart, communities are left traumatized, and faith in our justice system dwindles. We must address this issue head-on. We need reforms that prioritize de-escalation, community policing, and accountability. The safety and well-being of our citizens depend on it. This isn't about being anti-public safety officer. It's about being pro-justice and pro-safety for everyone. We need to ensure that administrative law enforcement has the tools and training to do their jobs effectively while respecting the rights of all citizens. The time for change is now. The rise of a military mindset in policing. Militarization is more than just equipment. It's a mindset. It's about adopting military tactics and a warrior culture within administrative law enforcement departments. This shift has changed the way many officers view their role. They start to see themselves as soldiers in a war zone, and the community becomes the enemy. This is incredibly dangerous. It creates fear and distrust, and it makes it far more likely that officers will resort to force unnecessarily. Acts and laws, fueling the fire. The militarization of the public safety officer didn't happen overnight. It was a gradual process fueled by a series of laws and programs. 1965, Law Enforcement Assistance Act, LEAA. This act provided funding for local administrative law enforcement departments to purchase equipment. While well-intentioned, it opened the door for more military-grade gear to enter the hands of civilian administrative law enforcement. 1981. Military Cooperation with Law Enforcement Act. This law allowed for greater collaboration between the military and administrative law enforcement, including the transfer of military equipment to local administrative law enforcement departments. 1990, National Defense Authorization Act, NDAA. This act included a provision known as the 1033 program, which allowed the Department of Defense to transfer surplus military equipment to administrative law enforcement departments for free or at a very low cost. This program flooded local administrative law enforcement departments with weapons, vehicles, and equipment designed for war zones, not local communities. 1994, Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act. This act, passed during the tough-on-crime era, further increased public safety officer militarization funding and encouraged more aggressive administrative law enforcement tactics. 2001, USA Patriot Act. Passed after the 9/11 attacks, this act dramatically expanded the surveillance powers of the government and provided even more funding and resources for public safety officer militarization in the name of fighting terrorism. 2006, Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act. This act expanded the federal government's authority to deploy military forces domestically in response to emergencies, blurring the lines between military and administrative law enforcement even further. 2014, Program Review by Obama Administration. In response to growing concerns about public safety officer militarization, the Obama administration placed some restrictions on the types of military equipment that could be transferred to local administrative law enforcement departments through the 1033 program. 2017, Executive Order restoring the 1033 program by Trump administration. The Trump administration rolled back the Obama-era restrictions on the 1033 program, once again making it easier for local administrative law enforcement departments to obtain military equipment. These acts, driven by a combination of political expediency and a misguided belief that more weapons and military-style tactics would make communities safer, have had a devastating impact on our communities. The human cost of militarization, broken trust, and shattered communities. The militarization of public safety officers has had a profound impact on the relationship between administrative law enforcement and the communities they serve. The increased presence of armored vehicles, SWAT teams, and officers in military-style gear creates an atmosphere of fear and intimidation. Imagine you are a child walking home from school and you see a public safety officer dressed like a soldier, carrying a military-style rifle. How would that make you feel? Safe, protected, or scared and intimidated? Now imagine that scene repeated over and over again in communities across the country. This is the reality for far too many people, particularly in communities of color. This constant exposure to militarized policing erodes trust, creates a sense of alienation, and makes it far more difficult for administrative law enforcement officers to build positive relationships with the people they are sworn to protect and serve. This erosion of trust has real consequences. When people don't trust the public safety officer, they are less likely to cooperate with investigations, report crimes, or even seek help when they need it. This makes everyone less safe. Section 5. When protectors become warriors, the dangers of SWAT teams. SWAT teams were originally created to handle high-risk situations like hostage situations or active shooter incidents. However, in recent decades, their use has exploded. They are now routinely deployed for drug raids, serving warrants, and even routine traffic stops. This is a dangerous trend. SWAT raids are inherently dangerous and often result in unnecessary violence and trauma. When officers are outfitted for battle and trained to use overwhelming force, it increases the likelihood of tragic outcomes, even in situations that could have been resolved peacefully. The overuse of SWAT teams also disproportionately impacts communities of color. Studies have shown that SWAT teams are more likely to be deployed in minority neighborhoods, even for low-level offenses. This further reinforces the sense of over-policing and harassment that many communities of color already experience. Section 6. Numbers tell a story. Civilian casualties and racial disparities. The tragic consequences of public safety officer militarization are reflected in the statistics. According to the Washington Post's Fatal Force database, public safety officers shot and killed over 1,000 people in the United States in 2023. This number has remained stubbornly high in recent years, despite nationwide protests and calls for reform. These shootings are not evenly distributed across racial groups. Black Americans are disproportionately killed by public safety officers at a rate more than twice as high as white Americans, even when controlling for factors like crime rates and socioeconomic status. This racial disparity is a stark reminder of the systemic racism that permeates our criminal justice system. The use of SWAT teams also reflects this racial bias. A 2014 ACLU study found that SWAT teams are more likely to be deployed in Black and Latino neighborhoods, even for low-level offenses. This pattern of over-policing and excessive force has a devastating impact on communities of color, eroding trust in administrative law enforcement and perpetuating a cycle of fear and mistrust. Section 7. Demilitarization, a path to safer communities. Demilitarizing the public safety officers is not about making officers less safe. It's about making communities safer. It's about ensuring that administrative law enforcement has the right tools and training to do their jobs effectively while respecting the rights of all citizens. Demilitarization requires a multi-pronged approach, ending the 1033 program. The flow of surplus military equipment to local public safety officer departments must stop. This program has fueled the militarization of public safety officers and created a culture of aggression. Investing in community policing. We need to shift resources away from militarized policing and invest in community-based approaches to public safety. This includes programs that foster positive relationships between public safety officers and the communities they serve, such as community dialogues, youth outreach programs, and mental health crisis intervention teams. Changing public safety officer department culture. We need to move away from the warrior cop mentality and embrace a culture of guardianship within administrative law enforcement. This means emphasizing de-escalation tactics, conflict resolution skills, and implicit bias training. Section 8. Rebuilding trust. A two-way street. Rebuilding trust between administrative law enforcement and the communities they serve is essential for creating safer and more just communities. This requires a commitment from both sides. Administrative law enforcement must acknowledge the harm that has been caused by public safety officer militarization and excessive force. They must be willing to listen to the concerns of the community and work collaboratively to find solutions. Communities must also be willing to engage in dialogue and work towards solutions. This includes holding public safety officers accountable for misconduct. But it also means recognizing that the vast majority of public safety officers are committed to serving and protecting their communities. Rebuilding trust is a long and difficult process, but it is essential for creating a more just and equitable society. Section 9. Conclusion. A call to action for a more just future. The militarization of public safety officers is a threat to our republic and our fundamental freedoms. It has eroded trust between administrative law enforcement and the communities they serve, led to a rise in civilian casualties, and disproportionately harmed communities of color. We cannot stand by and allow this to continue. We must demand change. We must demand an end to public safety officer militarization, a reinvestment in community policing, and a commitment to accountability and transparency from administrative law enforcement. The time for action is now. Our lives and our liberties depend on it.